All right, great. Thank you.
So we want to talk about food safety. Do I have the right meeting?
You're in the right
Yep,
spot.
you're good.
Okay. Okay. I was beginning to wonder there for a moment if I had gotten the right slides in the right meeting. But food safety has occupied my particular career from September of 1967, when I was given this assignment that we needed to do something in the area of food safety. And I suddenly found out that I was a pioneer. And from there, we look at the way that the world impacts food safety. And what I want to share with you a lot today about history of how food safety changed starting in 2007. Now, at that particular time in September of 2006, we had a problem with spinach and E. coli. And on the tail end of that, almost the same week, there was issues of botulism in jars of carrot juice. And then that was followed by peanut butter on Valentine's Day of 2007. And then in March on St. Patty's Eve, we had a problem with melamine showing up in pet food. And this probably had the biggest impact upon food safety, even though it was pet food at the time. And then following shortly thereafter was botulism issues related to canned chili. And so the consumer started voicing their concern regarding human food after the melamine issue. And this was a one-time purchase of an ingredient that was picked up by the processor in their feeding tests of when they manufactured pet food to serve it to their animals in evaluating the particular product. So the key drivers was the contaminated melamine, where the consumers started talking about, well, if that's in pet food, what about human food? And so that was about a month later that you saw that blossoming. And so they wanted to know, well, what's in the food I'm feeding my family? And you saw the 800 consumer lines light up with questions about the food, where it was produced, what the ingredients were, and where did the ingredients come from? And as we dealt with that particular issue. And it was at that particular time that the consumers started talking about food safety in an attempt to protect their family, and thought about buying local, buying organic, or buying natural. Or they also started talking heavily about having a clean label. And so that meant that they wanted some of the preservatives and other things out of particular products. And it moved then into the artisan type producers. And some of the major changes in what we were eating was going on, some good, some bad. But at the same time, this created some highlights on food safety issues because of the weakness in the marketplace by some of the smaller operators that suddenly had their focus on their particular products. So as at the same time, we had food production consolidations taking place, and the products actually over the years have become more complex. And with the all the good work in packaging, we had extended shelf life, which added to some of the concerns as we deal with pathogens. And then we had the global impact in about this particular area that really came to head as we looked at the complexity of the food distribution system. But at the same time, the consumer has changed by some people getting older, but the science has also changed. And epidemiology probably had the biggest impact. But 2007, June 29, 2007, I remember the day and this particular announcement that took place, and that was the iPhone. Twitter had already been established, and so what the iPhone did at that particular point really increased the communication as it related to food safety and provided a lot of social change that impacted the particular business. I did my first product recall in 1967 and I've kind of become a nerd at that. The latest recall I've been involved in working on was yesterday. And so I have collected some trend lines that I feel are quite important. If you go back in 2007, as the market changed, we saw a dramatic change in the number of recalls that took place in the US. And only in the last couple of years have we seen those numbers of recalls drop down. And there's a lot that we can learn from recalls. And we always think of a recall being somebody else's problem and not our own, because we tend to believe that our system is perfect and we are immune to having a product recall. But that is not true. Every one of the recalls has a teachable moment, and we need to be looking at these as we look at preventative food measures that we can employ in our own particular operation. And certainly it's cost effective when you look at the cost of doing a massive recall. But it's interesting to look at these trends, because the trends are very similar in Canada, in Europe, and in some of the Asian countries, as you see the number of recalls going up. What is the trend as it relates to reason for the recalls? Well, the number one issue is normally microbiological issues, but also food allergens are right on the heel year after year. In recent times, we've seen some dramatic increases in foreign material being in product, as well as we look at foreign material, we will see some of the trends that are taking place. That was FDA. This is USDA. And again, we look at the battle between microbiological problems and allergens. And again, foreign material being a particular problem. But in USDA and meat inspection, we have imports coming in periodically that have not faced USDA meat inspection in a foreign country, and they contribute to recalls. Well, what products? Well, this looks like the whole pantry as you look at these, but dairy in this particular time period, there were a number of dairy recalls as it relates to allergens and some microbiological problems in smaller operators. The past few days, there was one particular dairy recall because of under processing. It was not properly pasteurized. You look at deli, you have allergens and you have microbiological problems. And you look at spices with a lot of microbiological problems, and baking ingredients, microbiological issues that have shown up there that in our traditional foods we didn't think about as being problems, the same as in peanut butter. We didn't think about peanut butter providing a means of survival for salmonella. We thought it would not grow, but it does survive. And in some other products that we're learning new things as we go along. As we look at microbiological problems, it's interesting to note in 2018 and 2020, about 40% of the USDA recalls have been Listeria, and about 39-40% of FDA regulated products have been Listeria, followed by Salmonella, again, very similar in numbers. And so those are some of our targets that we have to be looking at in our control programs. As we look at allergens, there are similarities, milk being the probably the most frequently stated reason for an allergen recall. And this is pretty true as you look at Canada and you look at Europe and now in Southeast Asia as well, in some of their allergen recalls taking place. And so these things you have to be on your toes all the time and looking at labels and ingredients and processes in order to prevent allergen concerns in operation as it relates to cross contact. We look at foreign material. The big issues in FDA have been plastic. There's been some very large recalls because of plastic in products. I was in a facility recently and they were doing a school lunch program and they were using a very clear, lightweight film for lining their totes and their containers in the plant. And it was very difficult to see, and plastic of that nature provides a choking hazard you have to be concerned about. Many plants use a colored plastic that is would be in contrast in their particular products. Metal, as you see with the USDA, as well as FDA, it continues to be a problem. This needs to be managed through sanitation, looking for wear, and through maintenance and preventative maintenance activities. We look at USDA, we got the same thing with plastics, pretty well dominated in 2020 for reason for foreign materials. And so we have to constantly being on the lookout there. Contributing factors to the cause of recalls. I look at the sanitation inspections that FDA does as far as FSMA is concerned. And in 2020, there were 1,749 483s or observations the inspectors made in the plant that were in violation of regulation. And over 85% of those particular were contributed to 15 different CFR references, and primarily remain related to equipment design, the general maintenance and repair of food processing facilities. Here is the list of the citations that you probably need to go back and take a look at, see how they apply to your particular operations. But this is the 15 that we're looking at here. And as we look at these, again, we will see issues with pest control has been in the top group for decades. We have operations where the hazard analysis was not properly done. We have issues with hand or personnel issues, primarily hand washing. And the big common one here is the temperature of the water in the plant for the employees to wash their hands in. Science says the temperature is not a critical issue in proper hand washing. The big comfort factor should be what is the temperature that the employees want for washing their hands. But the other thing is on facilities, do we have the proper sinks for people to wash their hands? I was in a plant not too long ago. They had about 25 employees working in this area, and they had one small hand sink, which didn't really encourage people to wash their hands because of the time that they were spent waiting. And so from an ROI standpoint, I was pointing out to the owner that he could probably save money and get more production by providing additional hand washing facilities. But monitoring the sanitation operations and maintenance of the plant, these have always been in the top group of violations noted in how well a company is maintaining their facility, how well it was constructed and designed are critical factors as we look at some of the food safety things that lead to recalls. Equipment design, sanitary design is a key part in that. The first thing, the most commonly item mentioned was foreign supplier verification, where people had not implemented that particular program. So if you are bringing ingredients in from outside of the country, you want to make sure that you have your foreign supplier program in place. And so it kind of comes down to sanitation, sanitary design that contributes to sanitation, maintaining your facilities, maintaining equipment, and knowing where your ingredients are coming from, and that they have to meet the same requirements in a foreign country that you have in your particular operation, and you have to document that that's happening. Because after all, as we look at the world, sometimes people think of it as being flat as we deal with food safety issues, but that's not true. It varies all over the board. The big change that I talked about in food safety was the evolution of epidemiology. We started out with PFGE patterns in 1984 that developed into the FoodNet sites. I believe there were 10 FoodNet sites that represented about 15% of the population. And CDC from that particular point would extrapolate out and the number of incidences that were being reported in those areas, what the total burden may be in foodborne illness. And some of those numbers that we live with today came back several years ago. Now we have PulseNet, which is nationwide in 2001, but now it is worldwide, and other countries contribute. The big change was the DNA fingerprint technology of 2005, that we were able to better track the causative agents as we deal with foodborne illness. And then came along the FDA Reportable Food Registry in 2007, making it a requirement for firms that identify a contamination that may lead to a serious adverse health situation or possible death had to be reported to FDA within 24 hours. This led to some additional recalls that may not have been counted in years past. Then there was a consolidation of the epidemiology teams that work out of CDC, FDA, and USDA as they were getting into better able to share and to coordinate their investigation activities. The regulatory inspections have started in 2010 by FDA, was an eye-opener to the industry as well as FDA in identifying pathogens in food production plants. In 2013, with the whole genome sequencing taking place, this meant a little different method of tracking things down, and now they have that capability in most of the state laboratories out there. This is an example of how we have grown with epidemiology. This is 2007, when there was an identification of Salmonella Tennessee. CDC told me that they were looking at these little incident numbers of 2 and 4 cases per week as maybe background information. And this went on in 2004, 2005, and long about October, November of 2006, there was a major rainstorm that went through the southeast corner of the US. And that changed the picture a little bit, because the firm producing a product had a problem with roof leaks, and water was in the operation. And all of a sudden, number of Salmonella Tennessee cases were doubling by week. And it was along on Valentine's Day of 2014 where they had identified a product, which in this case was peanut butter, and they identified brand, they identified a plant, and the recall was almost 2 months after they started seeing drastic changes that were taking place. So that was the situation in 2007. And then there was another peanut paste issue in 2009, where we see that the recall had taken place after a number of people had become ill. And so this was kind of after the fact, as you see the number of cases going down at that particular point. And now you get into 2013, where whole genome sequencing was used, where they quickly identified the commonality between 8 cases, with 7 of them being hospitalized and 1 death. And within a very short period of time, they identified the product and forced a recall. And then after the recall and then FDA investigation, they closed the plant. But this is part of the trend that we'd seen in epidemiology over the years. And this happened to be the recall in 2015 when a state lab was doing an investigation on a new test kit, and they identified a positive sample from somebody's ice cream in the lab in the state, and only there have been 10 cases involving 3 deaths, but this is over a 5-year period of time, and then that forced a recall to take place. And again, with new technology, that brings that to a head pretty quickly. And here's a more recent one where we've got 11 cases and 2 hospitalizations. And within a short period of time, we invoked a recall before additional people had become victims of this particular contamination. So we live in a micro world, but with the new technologies, we are able to get on top of these things much quicker. And with the assistance of the National Institute of Health's library, where specimens are stored from way back in 2000, early 2000s. They make a good reference point when somebody has a positive of where the source may be, because in that particular database of 600,000 different samples, they're coming from all over the US as well as foreign countries feeding into that these days. So whole genome technology can identify a group of ill consumers fairly quickly, identify a common product, a manufacturer, and they can even go to an area of a production plant and even to identifying a piece of equipment. How, just major improvements in the technology of identifying foodborne illness. Consumers' concern about food safety. This was last updated in 2018 when consumers were asked about what's your confidence level of food that you purchase from the grocery store and products that you produce or purchase from the restaurant. And I would say that this is pretty typical of the risks that might be associated. When the consumers were asked who do they rely on to ensure the food they purchase is safe, in 2018, they indicated they themselves felt that they were ensuring, but they also indicated the government, 50% felt they were comfortable with what the government was doing in protecting their food supply, and grocery stores at 45%, food manufacturing at 37, and they gave credit to the consumer groups and the farmers at the bottom of the list. When consumers were asked where did they believe food safety problems originate, the first one they picked was food processing. That's because of probably the size of the recalls that were being reported in food manufacturers. They didn't anticipate the warehouse or transportation were major contributors, nor the store. That was probably because the amount of packaged products that they find in a retail store. But I would anticipate that some of that may change as stores' offerings change. But they place only about 6% believe that it may be happening in their own home. What were their concerns? They were concerned about microbiological. It was a big one. Pesticides has always been top of the list. And when you look at the pesticide residue testing and monitoring, I have always placed that pretty well down at the bottom of the list. But it's interesting also to see in 2018 that consumers were concerned about tampering and terrorism as it related to food safety health risks. But you will also see they also name some countries as a source. When the actual occurrence of product contamination probably most often happens in the consumer's home, food service, food manufacturing, and food retail is the way that they had ranked them in the U.S. Grocery Shopper Trends Survey in 2018. I've got to mention sanitary design. As we noted in the inspection results of FDA as well as local health departments, facilities and food contact surfaces being maintained in a sanitary condition is top of the list. Installation of the equipment so it can be properly cleaned, and human factors have to be taken into consideration as we look at those things. How is that equipment installed? Can it be broken down? Can you see every bit of it? Can you touch, smell, and closely inspect that particular material? To pick up a little bit on food safety culture is something that we're talking about, we're seeing improvements in, and we look at the various aspects that go into what makes up food safety culture. And it's the team that's in the operation, it's their behavior, it's integrity of the company, it's the ethics of the company, and who facilitates it in the operation, because everybody has a piece of it. And so the big thing comes from the stage being set by the leadership team as it relates to maintenance of the facility, the condition of the restrooms, contributing factors, the appearance of the operation internally within the operation, and the pride that they take in producing the product is all part of that food safety culture that's kind of established and encouraged by the leadership team. But I would ask the people attending, what is your core values that contribute to food safety culture? I would suggest that you take a clean sheet of paper and start making these notes on your own personal food safety culture, on what you have to offer in an establishment or a health department, or if you're an inspector, what do you have to offer in the area of food safety culture that will help a establishment improve what they're doing? And so just think about your own contributions. I'm a big fan of this guy. Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain during World War II. And if you're ever in London, you should visit the location to where he was moved to during the bombing of in World War II. And his comments were, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. I see that every day. You see that in recalls. Today, there are very few new twists and turns to a recall. Most of them are a repeat of what happened last month, last year, at some other buddy's plant. We don't pay attention to how that might apply to our operation as well as we should. And you need to take a little bit of time and make sure that you do not repeat the history of what's going on elsewhere. You want to be a step ahead of that. Food safety is more than a wish or a hope or a prayer. It involves responsibilities. Each of us that's involved in the food industry, whether it's a corporation or personally, we have moral responsibility to do what is right for our customers. We have a legal responsibility to do what is right as it relates to meeting regulatory requirements. One of our biggest things that keep us from doing some of these things is complacency. And if we look complacency up in the dictionary, it is self-satisfied when accompanied by unawareness. That's why I was talking about recalls, looking at what can we learn from a recall? How do we challenge and how do we move forward? Because we tend to start with self-satisfaction in ways and things that are, and not really trying harder to make improvements to prevent problems from occurring. We start accepting less than what we should, and the next thing we know, we have problems. So think about that. Think about what you do on a day-to-day basis. We cannot accept complacency attitude about food safety, especially in meeting consumer expectations. It's critical on that particular factor because food safety is a shared responsibility. No matter what your job may be, if you are dealing with food, it goes all the way from the field to the table. It's a shared responsibility of doing the best that we can in preventing food safety problems. Because food safety is a journey, not a destination. You must continue to strive for improvement each and every day in fulfilling consumer expectations. And that is one of the purposes of meetings such as this, in providing you with that opportunity to continue on this journey of addressing food safety. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Gail, for that presentation. I think it's interesting. I agree 100% that everybody from field to fork is involved in food safety. And I think it's interesting to me that you showed a slide where the majority of the contamination happens. It isn't always where people think that it happens. So that was interesting. Let me see, I'm not seeing any questions, but oh, here's one from Amy Rhodes. With all of the experience you have had with recalls, do you feel we are getting better? I know that with technology, it's easier to link recalls, but are we actually getting better or are we staying about the same?
We are getting better with the larger companies And we're still struggling with the smaller companies as it relates to understanding recalls. I find recall manuals with dust setting on them on the shelf. I just wrote a new recall policy for a company yesterday. And one of the problems I see out there is that we are doing traceability exercises and not doing mock recalls. What I am saying is that mock recalls are a kind of a 2-point area. One has to do with understanding the recall process, the responsibilities. And then the other part of that mock recall is the traceability in identifying the product. These things, we talk about doing a traceability exercise at least once a year. I recommend twice a year, but doing a complete mock recall, review and training and exercise for the recall team at least once a year. And that will improve drastically how recalls take place. Too many people have their head in the sand as it's always the other person's problem. But once in a while your luck runs out and it's suddenly your problem. And what do we do next?
Gail, can you talk a little bit about, you said that water temperature is not a critical issue for hand wash, but that the comfort factors is important. So we have, it's a requirement, you have hot and cold running water at the hand sinks. And that's been the way it's been forever. Do you think that the hot water thing is not as important, or are you talking about reducing the ability, like if you've got super hot water that you're not going to scald people? Where were you going with that?
Hot and cold running water through a mixing valve on the sink is the key thing. Many of the violations that were identified in the 483s related to the actual temperature of the water. And science has indicated that the temperature of the water is not that critical as long as it's comfortable for the employee washing their hands. And so if the temperature of the water is 2 degrees off, I believe there's some other items in that particular operation that are more critical than that 2 degree temperature variations that the firm is being charged with. I was in one facility, they had 23 sinks as you walk in. So 23 employees can wash their hands at one time and other facilities that may have one hand wash basin. And certainly that's part of culture as well that you're establishing right there when they come in and start work.
So I'm not seeing any more questions or any hands raised. So that's good. Thank you very much, Gail, for that talk. It's always a good reminder to remember all these pieces. And I wrote down what you said about that we need to think about what the core values that we hold are that contribute to food safety culture. And I think that's a good message for all of us to really nail down what it is that we really have as core values on that. So thank you for that.